Hello. Well, we're going to talk about typography for new and better readers, as you know. In order to develop a typographic font with good performance in children's text, we found ourselves in the need of finding out what kind of morphological characteristics these fonts should have to facilitate the reader's learning process. To do this, we required a series of practical tests that expose both the existing theories and our own, hoping to find some enlightening results. Our perspective. Okay, we hypothesize that the recognition of characters is a determining factor in the design of fonts for children. This is about how we learn to read. Based on the idea that the learning process consists in recognizing first the alphabet, then the syllables, and finally the words as a unit itself, which from the beginning implies an identification of characters by the student. This means that most children learn to read letter by letter, relating sounds to shapes until they can combine them and form words, at least in the early phases of the process. There are three ways to read. The first one is decoding the word, turning the letters into sounds, combining the sounds, and pronouncing the word. The second has to do with the memory, observing the word, invoking a trace of its shape, and its pronunciation by memory. And finally, we talk about reading by analogy, deducting its pronunciation due to its similarity to a known word. In any case, the recognition of the shapes plays an important role.
But it is also about how we perceive the letters. From the field of legibility, Sophie Bayer, in her book, Reading Letters, Designing for Its Legibility, indicates that there are two large groups of small characters that generate recurring reading errors because they are often mistaken for each other. The first group integrates round characters E, C, A, S, N, U, and second group includes all vertical and narrow characters I, G, L, T, F. As for the capital letters, 5 groups are identified: the round shapes O, Q, D, C, G, the diagonal shapes U, B, Y, W, M, K, the vertical shapes T, I, L, G, T, I, G, L, and those that mix the vertical, and the horizontal F, B, P, E, T, H, and those that have two vertical shapes, H and N. Capital letters tend to generate more problems in the terms of confusion of the shapes, perhaps because their lines, although simple, are always straight, making a very homogeneous rhythm. Additionally, their heights are practically the same, lacking clear distinctive elements. Also, the process of identifying typographic shapes puts memory to use, which looks in its database previous knowledge for similarities between objects until they are identified. Jorge de Buen says about the identification process: the mind makes judgment based on previous situations where the perceiver, facing a similar stimulus, decides what his attitude towards the perceived object should be.
Okay, let's talk about the study. We decided to conduct a field study that includes primary school students between 6 and years old, students in the process of learning to read, to identify whether the theories of recognition of characters are true or not. We did a series of tests consisting of projections of 2 types of samples, isolated letters and words. In order to obtain the answers of the participants, we requested them to perform drawing and writing exercise. We measured parameters such as speed, accuracy, and correctness of the answers. The evaluation of the test was obtained in 2 levels: quantitative, meaning percentages, and qualitative, meaning the analysis of the perception of the fonts. It is important to remark that there are several studies that support this exercise, but none of them have been carried out in Mexico. Our general objective was to identify which characters present the greatest difficulties of the extension or confusion among the first readers, find out if typographic styles directly affect the distinction of letters, and determine which morphological ticks benefit or worsen this identification?
And now we're talking about which fonts
We use.
which fonts and why. The fonts we chose for the text can be grouped in three. First, fonts used in Mexican public textbooks for children who are learning to read. We found out that in the last 30 years, there have been using mainly two fonts that, in general terms, are sans serif with minimal contrast, simple and static geometrical shapes that resemble circular and square strokes, vertical axes, closed shapes, and classical proportion. We choose Grotesk and Futura. And second, fonts that claim to be designed for children. We chose fonts suggested by the graphic, editorial, and type design field, fonts that claim to be suitable for first readers' publications. The premises regarding these fonts are simple, clear, and standard shapes, similar to the models used to teach writing, letters that are easy to replicate. Includes the shape of single story A and G, large H height, open and round contour shapes with normal width. We chose Sassoon Infant, which is a sans, and Bembo Infant, which is a serif. And third, fonts we chose for his characteristics. For his characteristics. Serif or semi-serif fonts with a warm and friendly design, heavy blonde serif with diversification, and its terminals above and below are not exactly the same, and a medium color. We choose Spencer and Scholar, which is a Spencer, which is a semi-serif, and Scholar, which is a serif. Finally, we also interview teachers and understand what difficulties they encounter in teaching the reading process and the use of typography. It is important to mention that there are variables that make the sample difficult. Attention span is minimal. Kids get bored so fast, and you have entertainer charisma.
You have to have.
Yeah, to have an entertainer charisma.
Okay, let's talk about the results and the analysis that we made. We have two different kinds of tests. The ones that use samples with isolated letters that we chose from the groups of the morphological similarities, and the test we use word samples that contain at least two letters of the same group. These include words that kids can easily recognize because they already have them in their daily vocabulary. The first exercise was identification of the main features. We projected words with morphological similar shapes, typed in all the fonts of the story, then we asked the children to write what they saw. Factors that we measured were ability to retain particular aspects in the letters, like serifs, and differentiation of typographic shapes. The objective was to identify the retention problems in the reproduction of the letter shapes, the confusion between them, the difficulty in the identification of certain features, or inability to differentiate specific typographic shapes. The results were the exercise IJL. The most identifiable shape was always the J, thanks to the well-marked descender it has. However, the output serifs in I and J equal to each other in Sassoon, having calligraphic terminations unknown to the students, caused the idea of an inverted J. Okay. We believe that this is, on one hand, due to the lack of familiarization of the student with serifs, and on the other hand, to the extreme similarity between the forms of calligraphic exits and the descenders of J. The second exercise, O, Q, D, C, and G. Since all shapes are round, the general tendency was to match the C and G and convert them to O. Another tendency was to confuse the U with the O. While we read a word or a sentence, our memory looks up for data that we already know. Many times we guess the word of the meaning of the sentences thanks to the context. In this case, because they were only seeing letter forms, the impossibility to give context with a known word meant putting into practice the short-term memory. That caused them to only retain the general shapes while trying to reproduce them, regardless of whether they corresponded or not to the ones presented. Exercise.
The exercise number 3 was B, D, and P and Q. Subjects identify the termination of enter and exit, even in the cases when they were exposed to sans-serif shapes. Some kids confused Q with A and Q with a single story A. Maybe because A is a better known shape, there are just problems caused by the use of poorly differentiated sans fonts. We think so. And also that the employed ductus generate more confusion than benefits. Children are taught to write around single story A made up of very simple circle and a stem, the same element that make up sans serif. So it is easy for them to get confused. Although the examples show contained mechanical forms that reproduce samples written by the kids following the manual logic they were taught. Second, differentiation of letters. We showed the students a letter for around 3 seconds, and then we represented print the same sample next to 5 other letters, asking them to choose the letter they saw. The factors that we measured were detection of possible confusion between shapes, objective demonstrate if a specific shape of a letter has some impact on the visual identification or confusion for typographic scenes. Differentiation of letters using Futura, L, I, J, F, and FBPE. There was a high rate of confusion between L and A. There was a high rate of confusion between F and A. This is likely because both shapes are almost identical to each other since they don't have any differentiated details. Yes. And second, differentiation of letters using Spencer, D, B, P, Q. There was a high rate of confusion between D and B. Also, the D shows a tiny axis Q, but shapes are very similar in their entry stroke and the shape of the bold. D and B are the big winners of the confusion at the time of writing. Even when the students read them correctly, they get confused at the time of writing them. It may be required to vary the entry stroke to help them to get a better shape recognition. And for the last, differentiation of letter using Futura, letter C. In this sample, we modify the equation by introducing 4 letters C from different fonts in the answer sheet, Grotesk, Future, Scholar, Spencer, and Bembo, while we projected just the Futura C. Also, not all the subjects manage to identify the precise letter show. They're determinate it was a sans, meaning that kids clearly identify a sans from a serif.
Okay, the third exercise was identification of words by its main features, meaning analyze the part by the whole. We projected just the upper part of the words. Later, we asked the participants to guess the word and write it. The factors that we measured were certainty of response and response time. The objective was to observe if the upper features of the letters are sufficient to allow the participant to read the word, and if there is a variation in the result depending on the fonts used. Okay, the first answer we have is O is often confused with a single story A in the word chaos. The double story A was correctly identified 80% of the times, whereas O was confused 45% of the times with N, C, and S. They saw a single story A every time, even if there is a double story A right next to it. For they was the same. This means that they don't understand that both A's belong to different systems. Perhaps if kids were taught the double story A from the beginning, they would be less confused. Okay, then second, the word podcast written with Futura was at least the least identified word with the 96.3% of fails. As it has no ascending characters and the letters have no particular signs, the information is scarce for the first reader. Letters like P have the same principles as N, H, and C, and the single story A. The A was confused with O and with R. 3. The word caldog, written with Bembo infant, was the second least identified word, with 70.4%. Although it is a word that has ascenders and the font has serifs, there is no clear differentiation of the shapes since it is very systematic. In the same way, Bembo infant uses a single story A and its characteristic features are so subtle that they do not allow a clear differentiation from an O or a C. Okay, last, in the word lodos, the letter L with serif was confused with the number 1. As they are not used to seeing a serif in the L, they confuse the shape with the only character they recognize with that particular shape, that is the number 1. Okay.
Okay. The last test is a personal taste. We presented words shaped with the sample fonts and asked them to choose the one they liked best. Factors to be measured: similarity of answers, objective, observe whether the participants relate to some specific shapes or not. The students showed most affinity for Futura in second place, Scholar and Spencer in third place. Some of them chose more than one option, even though they were asked not to do it. In this regard, we wonder if the choice of Futura has something to do with it being precisely the font they are familiar with, or if it is really a choice based on their actually liking. Conclusions.
Okay, let's talk about our conclusions. We have two main conclusions. Being constantly looking for simple and clean shapes makes it difficult for kids to distinguish some letters from others and makes the learning to read process harder. So if we keep presenting Mexican students with typographical forms that are similar to one another, wouldn't we be giving future readers very few resources to assist their memory in identifying and differentiating one letter from another effectively? Those more complex shapes with accessories and visible details are a really positive feature for children's learning to read process. We know that a typographic font is a system in which the similarity and standardization of its elements is the key to success in recognizing the basic shapes of an alphabet, but maybe including certain differentiation features in a controlled way can help the reader to recognize the characters at first sight. Our second conclusion is that there is an issue between shapes derived from calligraphy theories. Kids were able to replicate the double story A when they were asked to draw what they saw. They perfectly understood and associated the letter with its meaning and sound. When it became evident that kids could write more complex shapes without problem and that some shapes as a single story A or G generated confusion with other letters, we asked ourselves, is it really necessary to use fonts that resemble and relate to the ones of handwriting? Could handwriting adapt to the reading shapes? Okay. From the interviews to teachers, we found, as a teacher, I find inconsistencies between the shapes of the letters of the official textbooks, generally between a single story A and a double story A, which I describe as like a circle letter, O with a stick, and the shapes of the letters of other books, which are different and are also the ones they will come across most of the time. There are discrepancies starting from there. That's something that a first grade normalist teacher told us. As you can see, at the end of this study, we have more doubts than certainties. We consider it important to answer all of the questions that arise here to continue studying the incidence of the letters in the acquisition of reading language, to experience other academic scenarios and diverse socioeconomic levels that allow a broader panning of the typographical problem.
So finally, some ideas to keep working. Teachers are not aware of the pedagogical tool that typography represents. It will be a great idea to unite the different involved fields, typographic, pedagogy, and even the government publishers, in order to generate better additional products and teaching materials that could enhance teaching learning process. We also realized that the teachers do not know the potential of the typography and dislike the material they have to work with. From the interviews we read, as a teacher, I develop a lot of teaching materials at home and print it and then make copies, and have never thought of typography as a tool or something that I can use. I have never looking for fonts for my classes other than what I have on the computer. Our last idea in that digital typography is letters, but it could work as a didactic material by itself. Maybe this is a whole new world that we could explore by exploring open type features and possibilities to create easy-to-use digital tools for Word and PowerPoint to facilitate the reading, the recognition and memorization in the learning process. Thank you so much. Arigato gozaimashita. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.